member for Belfast Murray River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in QP, we spoke about the unprecedented steps the auditor took to bring her concerns around conflicts of interest and other potential criminal wrongdoing on the e-gaming scandal. Premier, why did your government deliberately limit the auditor's scope?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the scope given to the Auditor General was indeed wide. It was to look into all aspects of those transactions, and indeed she did. She interviewed almost 60 individuals, or thousands, more than 10,000 documents, and Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General gave a very thorough report, and Mr. Speaker, that included in the course of her evidence before public accounts, as I understand it, and in her report, that the Auditor General has no reason to believe that there was any criminal activity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Belfast Murray River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier says the auditor's scope was wide. She wrote an entire appendix outlining her scope and about how it was limited by Cabinet. Premier, what is your tired Liberal government hiding from the Auditor General and the people of PEI?
Good question. Didn't you hear there's new radio ads? Everyone likes them.
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General was asked to look into all of the events, and the scope was indeed wide. You can go back to the Order in Council from early March of 2015. And Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General took time. She looked into all of the evidence. She considered these matters. She made 15 recommendations, and Mr. Speaker, government has acted on all 15 of those. And Mr. Speaker, this all relates to activity that would have been concluded by early in the year 2012. Mr. Speaker, we have said from the outset that this is not the way we do business, and indeed that is evident. And Mr. Speaker, we have taken to heart everything the Auditor General has brought forward on this, and indeed we're learning and moving forward. Thank you.
The honourable member for Belfast Murray River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier talks about the thousands of documents, and I guess it's quality or quantity versus quality. She did not get all the documents that she needed or requested, and definitely did not get the whole story. Premier, will you admit the reason your government limited the auditor's scope was to avoid evidence from reaching her?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there was no such intent and no such activity or initiative on the part of government. There were multiple hours and indeed days spent together with the Auditor General, and as any issues arose in the course of her work, those were addressed directly. And Mr. Speaker, as the House will recall, even after the Auditor General produced her report and raised some concerns, we acted on government's initiative together with the cooperation of the Mi'kmaq Confederacy to provide even further documents, Mr. Speaker. This was a wide open inquiry. It was fully considered on the part of the Auditor General, and it was fully taken to heart by government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Honourable member, Belfast Murray River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, there's a whole page in the appendix about scope limitations by this government. The auditor clearly outlined that her scope was limited. There were literally hundreds of documents that she never saw, that this government continues to hide away. Or maybe they are gone forever. Premier, why is your tired Liberal government so afraid of the whole truth coming to light?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I mentioned earlier, and I'll say again, that the Auditor General looked into every aspect of this, into activities that had been really brought to a conclusion by February of 2012, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, if there's anyone who's tired here, I believe it's the opposition, and continuing to ask these same questions that have been answered. They've been answered by the answered by the Auditor General. They've been taken to heart by government, and indeed we've made it very clear, Mr. Speaker, and you can see it in how the economy of this province is going, Mr. Speaker, and how we are going with more and more transparency and openness, Mr. Speaker, that this province is going ahead because of the leadership that this government is giving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prove it, because Islanders don't believe it. You won't last all home week, and you know it.
Honourable member for Belfast.
Tweet about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and as much as they try to change the channel, I keep coming back to this because Islanders want answers. Mr. Speaker, the auditor took an entire chapter to spell out apparent conflict of interest situations for both Chris LeClaire and Melissa McCachran. She managed to identify these conflicts despite government destroying all records for both of these employees. Premier, why are you covering up corruption and criminal activity by your government's senior executives?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Honourable Premier.
Mr.
For that.
Mr. Speaker, those are strong words, but let me remind this House and the opposition that within weeks of coming to government in 2015, Mr. Speaker, this government extended conflict of interest requirements and the whole regime to deputy ministers and senior officials, and that's precisely because, as we said, Mr. Speaker, that we are a government that does business a new way with openness and transparency, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we're giving the people of this province. Thank you.
The Honourable member, Belfast Murray River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For some reason, I need to keep reminding these guys that the Auditor General is the financial watchdog. She's not a police officer or a criminal investigator. She was deliberately handcuffed by this government and still managed to find these conflicts of interest, even after all records were destroyed. Premier, why are you so desperate to avoid a proper, independent investigation of your e-gaming scandal and deleted emails disgrace?
Good question. That's a good question.
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of emails, this House would be well aware that government has come forward with a whole new initiative. It's been considered in estimates. There's legislation before the House. There's been a program outlined with a 5-year plan as to how we're going to deal with this and deal squarely with the public records, the emails, in a way that's going to be that's going to meet the concerns that were raised by the Auditor General. And Mr. Speaker, that's another indication of the good government that we're giving this province on a go-forward basis, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, we have from the very beginning looked at this question that was given to the Auditor General as an opportunity for our government, for this House, for the people to learn and work together on a go-forward basis. It's going to give all of us good government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Stratford-Kinloch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr.